Welcome back, Senior Devs. Sean Cannon here. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to do a comprehensive analysis for a new project. Often when presented with a new project, we want to understand what we are getting ourselves into and get a clear picture of the scope and state of things before putting pen to paper. Typically, this scenario pops up either when you are freelancing and need to bid on a project which has an existing presence, or if you work for an agency and need to help the sales team understand the scope of the work so they can bid and eventually get an SOW in front of the prospect. Bidding on greenfield projects is a very different approach, and we won't cover that in this module. You typically have much more control over the stack and infrastructure and need to work with the client much more at the product level. Bidding on projects which have some established infrastructure presents a lot of questions that need to be answered before you can even think about writing code. Are you replacing the existing product entirely? Are you extending the existing product? Are you making a new product that depends on the existing product? Are you simply upgrading the presentation layer of the existing product? Are you being asked to fix or improve part of the existing product's core infrastructure, like improving security or performance, for example? These are some examples of questions that I would be asking, which would lead to follow-up questions like whether or not we need to work on legacy code, or if we're simply going to leverage APIs, and which team would be responsible for developing those APIs. Ultimately, you want to find out what is the underlying deliverable for which you would be assuming responsibility. You don't have to get this perfect, but you do need an SOW to be written in such a way that if the client suddenly expects you to take responsibility for legacy support, that the scope and budget are adjusted so you are compensated for time and materials. When I do a comprehensive analysis for a new project, I always assume the worst possible scenario. It is so easy to miss one thing and accidentally promise to deliver something that will end up costing you more money than you earn from the whole project. Things I want to understand first are typically which programming language or languages are we dealing with? Which frameworks or libraries are currently implemented? Have they been maintained, or are they deprecated or in need of updates? We don't need to necessarily worry about upgrading these tools, and oftentimes it's better if we don't and leave them alone, because there's a big risk of introducing regressions, and we don't want to be dealing with that if we don't have to. Is the code under version control? Does it use one of the common ones like Git or Subversion? Or is it some custom proprietary thing that will throw a giant learning curve wrench in the ramp up? Is the code deployed to a self-hosted repo, or is it in the cloud? This is a big deal when it comes to developer provisioning. How quickly can we onboard new devs to the project and handle access management? Self-hosted repos often have to be provisioned internally from the client, so we need to be aware of process bottlenecks. Is there a content management system in place? How is it deployed and managed? Does it have an edit history in place, or is there a risk of devs collaborating data while we test and build? Is there a sandbox tier, or can we run the CMS locally even? Does the CMS offer an API, or does it build static files on disk? A big monolith CMS can create development nightmares because replicating the local dev environment becomes extremely difficult. Oftentimes, we're stuck working with what the client has, so knowing this upfront can help set realistic expectations with prospects. Does the CMS provider offer a Docker container that we can run locally? Does it need a license, or can we run it for free? Regardless if there's a CMS or not, can we run the existing product locally and offline? If not, do we need to be on a VPN to work? This can create challenges when you have offshore devs on your team because oftentimes client SecOps put restrictions on onshore IP access only. This may require offshore devs to daisy chain VPNs and can really slow down deliverables. What databases are in play? Are they SQL, NoSQL, Graph? Is there a data warehouse and do we need to care about it, or are the backups completely automated? Is there an ORM being used, or are we using raw SQL queries? Are devs allowed to write queries, or do we need to go through a DBA? Is the existing product using database migrations, or how are devs expected to get database table alterations and schema changes deployed? Is the database using any replication, like CouchDB for a mobile app, for example? Is the existing product a big data app with hundreds of billions of records, and are we able to work locally with a significantly smaller subset of the data? Is there a cache layer? What kind of cache is being used? An in-memory database like Memcached or Redis? A file cache? Waterfall cache? Are devs able to purge the cache, and do we have insight on cache expiration? Cache is great for end-user experience and for keeping database costs down, but it creates development nightmares when we want to rapidly troubleshoot things. We need to understand what cache is in play and how much control we have. Which keys are being used in the system? SSH keys, API keys, and so on. Would each developer need his or her own keys, or could we share keys? How are keys managed so they remain secret, for example? Would our code need to make calls to AWS Secrets Manager or something, or can we blindly expect keys to be provided from DevOps through environment variables? Are devs able to remotely connect to a deployed instance of servers or databases using SSH or other credentials? If not, how are we expected to remotely troubleshoot issues? What kind of logging is being used? Are we allowed to connect to a remote logging service like Splunk or an Elk Stack? Does the existing product do trace logging and round-trip logging? Is there any instrumentation in place like New Relic that would complement the logs? How does the existing product handle permissions? Does it use role-based access control or another approach? How are roles and permissions created and managed? Are they managed externally through an admin interface, or is it all baked into the code and managed by the dev team? How does the existing product handle authentication? Does it use JSON Web Tokens or cookies for sessions? Does it use OAuth or basic auth? Does it use SAML or OIDC for single sign-on? We always want to understand authentication for apps because we want to ensure our local dev environment is able to leverage the same authentication strategy if possible. Oftentimes I'll see projects where the auth gate only exists on production. Devs and internal staff just get a free pass to a non-authenticated experience. This is okay if Authgate is its own deployed app and is managed by DevOps and SecOps, because then they can just put the gate in front of whatever URLs they want to and use middleware to check to see if the deployed apps have been gated or not. But we still want to understand what's currently in place and whether or not we need to accommodate it. So we just covered a bunch of typical questions. This is knowledge that needs to be obtained before we can really bid on a project. Typically for freelance projects, I'll sell an 8-hour comprehensive analysis SOW, basically 1 day for me to deep dive into their system and just ask all the questions I just mentioned, more or less so I can bid on the actual job. If they don't want to pay me for the time to do a deep dive, then I typically move on, because my time is extremely valuable to me, and obviously for huge clients like Salesforce or Google or something, you may want to do the comprehensive analysis for free, because it may be a smart move to take a loss if you're able to use them on your portfolio to gain work in the future. If you work for an agency, you'll likely do these kinds of deep dives on the regular, and then who cares if the prospect pays your agency or not, because the agency will pay you either way. There's a lot more pressure though, because the agency will depend on you to expose as much potential profit leak as possible before they sign an SOW. Your homework for this module is to take the list of questions I just covered and answer them for your current project. Don't just answer them from memory, pretend you were just granted access. Where would you need to look for the answers? Who would you need to ask? Who would you need to ask to learn who else you would need to ask? Don't spend a full day on this, obviously, but feel out the steps involved in doing a deep dive on your own project and see if there's anything I listed that you don't know yet. This could be a great opportunity for you to improve your overall understanding of your project. I've copied my sample comprehensive analysis into the module below this video so you can use it as a guide. Every project is different, so the analysis for your project may vary. For example, if you're a game developer, you would be asking about which platforms need to be supported, which gaming engine is used, and so on. If you need any help with this, please reach out in the Facebook group. That wraps up this module. Keep growing, and I'll see you in the next one.